Good morning from Washington, D.C. As Director of the Atlantic Council's Africa Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very timely conversation about the crisis in Sudan. The conflict in Khartoum is entering its third month with no end to the fighting in sight. The options for a transition to democratic civilian governance are blurry, and the human rights concerns are mounting. The Africa Center has closely followed the evolving political climate in Sudan with the goal of acknowledging the country's geostrategic importance. In 2018, the Africa Center created a Sudan task force, which has produced leading research and hosted public and private briefings on the situation in the country. We have not waited the breakdown of the democratic transition to mark once again this geostrategic importance. Since last April, the Center has ensured Washington remains engaged on the issue by organizing a series of high-level events that bring together policy experts, stakeholders, and peace builders within the sea. Less than 2 months ago, as Sudan was growing into violence, the Africa Center hosted a panel discussion moderated by Ambassador Mary Yates here to better understand the crisis. This event drew on the critical experience from former US officials, the advocacy community, and the policy community that the Africa Center can bring together. In advance of expected US sanctions on Sudan, the Africa Center published an op-ed looking at the ways that the international community can put pressure on the generals in Sudan to stop the fighting, highlighting the critical role that the younger generation and civilians must play to shape the future of the country. The Africa Center continues to host conversations with key Sudanese stakeholders as part of our Voices of Sudan series. These efforts are not new, as the Africa Center hosted events with Sudanese Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok in 2019, Foreign Minister Mayam Al-Mahdi in 2021, among others, and they will continue. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for helping us better understand the nuances and impact of the fighting. That is why it's my honor and pleasure to welcome and thank our first speaker, Ambassador and former US Chargé d'Affaires in Khartoum, Sudan, Mary Yates, to help set the stage for us. Ambassador Yates serves as a diplomat at the Department of State in the US for 32 years. She knows very well. She has been the US ambassador to Ghana and Burundi and held positions in Kinshasa. She also served as deputy to AFRICOM, also as foreign policy advisor to the United States European Command, EUCOM, led by General Jim Jones, the Africa Center founder. Special assistant, she has been also a special assistant to the president, senior director for African affairs at the National Security Council of the White House. She serves as Chargé d'Affaires to Sudan, as you know, and in that capacity, she accepted to open this conversation. I was about to forget, knowing her involvement in the Atlantic Council. She's an active Atlantic Council board director. Ambassador Yates, over to you.
Thank you, Rama. That was too much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, even though it's early out here on the West Coast, to set the scene for our guests and also to posit a few questions. As you said, the civil war in Sudan that started April 15th is triggering a monumental humanitarian crisis, and it really threatens to destabilize the entire region. And I think this crisis has profound international security and economic implications for the United States and far beyond. We have to acknowledge that the US and other foreign diplomats are trying hard to stop the fighting. I think they're trying to improve access for humanitarian assistance, and they're trying to negotiate a return to civilian-led transition. But is this enough? Do we need to have a more constant diplomatic presence somewhere on the ground in Sudan or nearby? And are we doing enough to cut off the funding to the belligerents? Because certainly there are other external actors jockeying for influence and for their geopolitical advantage. I also think we have to recognize, and I'm so glad that my friend Nuraldeen is on, that the regional leaders from Kenya, Djibouti, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, they seek to mediate between the Sudan Armed Forces, the SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. But those talks remain on hold. Is there something that can be done to be more inclusive of African mediation? Because I certainly know from my experience, it's very valuable. I think we're all aware of the geopolitical importance of Sudan. It is at the crossroads of the Arab and African worlds. It's bordering on the Red Sea. So Sudan's destabilization could destabilize the entire greater Horn of Africa. Already, I understand there are 2 million people who have left their homes, many IDPs, but I think the latest statistic has over 630,000 who have fled to neighboring countries, which causes destabilization. And could this continuing violence possibly precipitate a massive refugee outflow to Europe, for example? Or could this all have an impact on trade through the Suez Canal? There are many international challenges. And I know that those who are gathered here on this session this morning, you already care and know about Sudan, or you wouldn't be here. But I wonder, what is it going to take to get more attention paid to Sudan's civil war? We were all riveted this weekend with the dramatic events in Russia, and it made me wonder aloud, well, what if the fate of the Wagner Group, will that somehow trigger more interest and attention to Sudan? Because we've known the Wagner Group in Africa that it likes to upend traditional governments, support violence, and in order to sort of garner sweetheart deals to monetize natural resources of African countries. This is also happening in Sudan. And how will Wagner's fate affect the relationship with the RSF, and Hemeti? And how will our partners in the Gulf react to the shifting sands in Russia? And again, let's not forget that it's the people, it's the humanitarian crisis affects the people of Sudan, the civilians, as the SAF and RSF battle. I think most of the wealthy and connected have been able to flee, but right there in Khartoum, and will probably tell us, there are millions suffering. I mean, they're without some of the basic necessities. And in Darfur, oh my goodness, the targeting of the non-combatants there and the resurgence of violence, this is cause for grave concern. We've seen this horror movie before, and the potential for ethnic cleansing is real. So let me take no more of this fabulous panel's time with my own musings. We have an esteemed group of speakers that are going to chart the trajectory of the conflict, explore the solutions of the impending humanitarian crisis, and review some of the options that are currently available to the international community. I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I remain really proud of the Atlantic Council's steady efforts to shed light on Sudan. But let me say a brief word about EJ, your moderator. Ernst Jan EJ Hogendorn was the senior advisor for the U.S. government's special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan from 2019 to 2023, and that was supporting Sudan's transition towards democracy and also the implementation of both the South and the South Sudanese peace agreements. Prior to that, EJ had many positions in Africa. He worked for the International Crisis Group. He was a sanctions expert with the UN panel of experts on Somalia and Sudan, a researcher for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. EJ has a PhD in public affairs and an MPA from the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And he's published many articles about African conflicts, peacekeeping, and peacemaking. So with that, EJ, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words, Ambassador Yates. It is certainly my pleasure and my honor to be moderating this discussion, and really do not need to repeat all the excellent questions that Ambassador Yates has posited for the group, and also for the community that's watching this discussion. It will be my honor again to ask some questions and to help moderate this discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest. That is Ambassador Nurul Dusati, the ambassador of Sudan to the United States during Prime Minister Hamdok's government prior to the coup. He is a storied ambassador, has a rich history, not just with the Sudanese government, but also with the UN, where he has served in many distinguished posts. I will turn it to you, Ambassador, if you could please give us kind of the context, what you see is happening internationally in terms of efforts to try to come to some kind of a negotiated, at least ceasefire or not end to the conflict. What do you think more could be done? And then I'll turn to the rest of the guests. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, EJ, and thank you, Mary, and thank you, Rama, and thank you, the Atlantic Council, for your continued concern about Sudan and all that you have been doing for Sudan before and after the coup and after the war. Yes, what's happening is that, of course, I wouldn't go back to, because I think Mary has set up the scene in a very, precise, concise, and all-embracing manner. So the question that you are, putting across to me, EJ, is about the international efforts. Well, we all know that the Jeddah process, ceasefire process, is encountering many difficulties for the simple reason that the two belligerents are not, I do not think that they are serious about stopping the war. Both of them think that they can go to the finish and that they cannot imagine the end game without them, being on the top, being the victors. But personally, I do not think that there's going to be a victor of this war. When you look at what's happening on the ground, you will see that it's a very complex situation. It's very difficult to imagine which of those sides can prevail. What would be the scenario even after, whether it is the SAF for the South, whether it is RSF going to emerge victor. Both scenarios for the Sudanese people will not be, a very positive outcome unless the civilians are involved in what's going on. And that takes me to the issue of civilians and the international community. Following, what's happening in Jeddah, we in the international community, I mean, in this on the civilian side, we do not think that there's going to be a military resolution to this problem, and that the solution has to be political. And for the solution to be political, the civilians have to be involved, because in the first place, the war erupted because it was against handing over power to the civilians. That's, the most important factor to my mind. I echo what Mary has said, that we need to see a more holistic process in which I would see the US and Saudi Arabia together with the African Union, IGAD, the UN and the EU conversing together in order to better coordinate their action and to stop, this what's going on now. I mean, the proliferation, I would say, of initiatives, issues between the African Union and IGAD, and we would like the international community to come together in order to see to it that our African organizations are doing their job adequately. And I would like to say that I would like to see the African Union more proactive in this conflict. I do not see the African Union, frankly, playing the role that we would have expected from the African Union. IGAD was mentioned, and I think that we should not allow the government of Sudan to pick and choose mediators. We do not allow the government of Sudan to pick and choose. IGAD has a responsibility as the sub-regional institution to play its role in stopping the conflict. And here, I think that the international community should see to it that IGAD is empowered to talk to the Sudanese government and see to it that the Sudanese government complies with our rules and regulations at the sub-regional. It's not the first time that IGAD plays its role, you know very well, with the CPA, and even before the CPA, IGAD has been involved. So in a nutshell, my message would like to see more cohesion, more coordination within the international community, and that all mediators and well-wishers will converge together in order to come to the rescue of Sudan. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador Sati. Now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Eva Kahan, who is a researcher with C4ADS. She has been looking at, I guess you could call it the political economy of Sudan for the last couple of years, co-author of the seminal report, Breaking the Bank, looking kind of at some of the illicit and licit arm flows that are that are supporting both sides, and she can give us some insight into, where is the money coming from that is allowing these parties to continue to prosecute the sides or to prosecute the conflict, and also, what can the impact of the sanctions that were imposed achieve, and what more perhaps needs to be done. Over to you, Eva.
Definitely. Thank you, EJ, for the moderation. Thank you to all of the other esteemed panelists, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting us all here today for this important conversation. I will try to keep my remarks brief so that we can get to the dialogue part of this conversation. And I think Ambassador Sati set the ground pretty well for some of the top lines here, notably that effective enforcement requires collaboration by the entire international community to defeat problems that we have known existed for a long time. As EJ mentioned, C4ADS has been reporting on the issue of military control of the Sudanese economy for over a year. We have known that this control over the economy was a threat to democratic transition since the civilian-led transitional government was in place. What we've seen is a delayed but notable response to this control of the economy in the U.S. sanctions that were issued, I believe, earlier this month. What we saw in those sanctions was an effort to target both sides with parity, including entities that have previously been assessed to control large portions of each belligerent's economic activity. However, these sanctions are not fully implemented to the degree that we would like to see in order to have them substantively impact the flow of both finance and potentially arms and salaries to fighters on the ground. In order to see more effective implementation, we would want to see these sanctions be defined to their fullest degree of expansiveness. I note this clear definition because some of these sanctions, particularly on a defense industry system, could be rather expansive in their legal scope because of the number of subsidiaries under that entity. However, because of the way that the sanction has been issued, it's not clear if the sanction is actually being enforced on subsidiaries of that entity, including dozens which have been identified in publicly available information. Some of these subsidiaries maintain public websites, likely on domains based in the US or elsewhere, as well as potentially continued trade with international actors. Future sanctions, in order to be more impactful, could be more expansively defined, more adaptive to the changes in company registrations or naming, which we've seen as an adaptation or evasion mechanism by Sudanese companies under the 1997 to 2017 sanctions regime. And furthermore, these sanctions could be multilateral. While we've seen strong US action, we have not seen EU or UK sanctions to join this effort, although that multilateral action could have a substantive impact. EJ also mentioned other ways that we can potentially leverage economic pressure in order to reduce the flow of both finance and arms to these belligerent parties. I'm sure we're going to touch on this in the conversation, so I'll only outline a couple other mechanisms that could be used here. There is opportunity for higher or more stringent regulation of high value exports, including gold. There is an opportunity for the international community to leverage additional pressure on states that may be providing weapons to the belligerent parties, particularly states within the Friends of Sudan. And lastly, sanctions have the ability to use economic pressure in order to shape who is influencing each of the belligerent parties, and particularly the influence of former members of the National Congress Party and their role in both financing and participating in the current conflict. I'll leave it to the rest of our esteemed guests to touch on these other topics and look forward to the further conversation.
Well, thank you for that, Eva. You've raised enough questions to take up the entire hour in itself, and perhaps we can do so in subsequent events as well that Atlantic Council may host. But to kind of to cover some of the other issues that are front and center of our concerns, I would love to pass the microphone to Kate Hickson. Kate Hickson is Advocacy Director for Africa for Amnesty International USA. Even before she worked for Amnesty International, she has long been watching Sudan and knows quite well what the events are on the ground. But Kate, if you could help take the audience through what is happening in the view of Amnesty, what you think more could be done to try to prevent some of the horrific crimes that are occurring right now, I think that would be of benefit to all the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, EJ, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for continuing to put focus on Sudan at this critical time. The situation in Sudan for civilians right now is horrific. As you've seen in the reporting in Khartoum, because there is fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the RSF in the streets, civilians are caught in the crossfire. The sides are using them as shields, which is increasing civilian deaths. Hospitals have been attacked, civilian infrastructure. But it's not just in Khartoum, unfortunately, as we've seen in the past weeks, the situation is really escalating in Darfur. There's been reports of ethnically motivated targeted killings, sexual violence, widespread burning of homes, and mass displacement of non-Arab residents. And this spiraling violence really bears terrifying similarities with war crimes and crimes against humanity that we've previously seen in Darfur. Furthermore, there's just a lack of communication, especially in West Darfur, and this isolation increases a risk of mass atrocities. We've also seen targeted killings and abductions of doctors, lawyers, journalists, members of the resident resistance committees. I think the assassination of the governor in West Darfur was very well publicized. In addition to this, I think there's real risk that we're going to see what happened in West Darfur spread to the rest of Darfur as well. And the reports coming out are, while not verified because of lack of access, are putting the numbers of deaths in Darfur alone at over 3,000 at this point. Obviously, the international community has made some statements toward this. The United States, to its credit, did establish the Yale Conflict Observatory, which has been helpful in starting to see more information. I certainly think that more needs to be done to continue to monitor the situation across the country. There's activists that are continuing to work and do documentation in very difficult circumstances right now. It's very difficult to get information out, and I think there are creative ways that the international community could think about helping these activists and human rights monitors get this information to the international community to inform their policy decisions. We saw a debate at the Human Rights Council. Amnesty International had called for an independent mechanism, but unfortunately we did not get that out of the HRC debate. I think, and we can talk about this more in the questions, we really need to see greater political heft from the United States in order to secure some of these things that will protect human rights defenders. When you don't see the senior members of the Biden administration making the calls themselves and advocating for what they're pushing for example, at the Human Rights Council or at the Security Council, you're less likely to see kind of effective policy implementation. But we can talk about that more in the discussion.
you, Kate. Sometimes not very good to be talking to Amnesty International, but thank you for raising those very, very troublesome issues. And to some degree, in the same vein, I'm turning the microphone over to Will Carter. Will Carter is the Sudan Country Director for NRC, who's actually based in the country. And he is going to be speaking to us about some of the humanitarian concerns that NRC is seeing and that his colleagues are trying to address, and speak a little bit about what more can be done. Over to you, Will.
Thank you, EJ, ambassadors, council members, and all the listeners. Really important topic. Clearly a devastating situation in the country. Pastor Mary Yates opened well, but this is one of the fastest and largest displacements we've seen. We didn't expect, although we saw years of a deterioration of Darfur after the AU-UN peacekeeping mission folded in the end of 2020, it wasn't foreseen that it would immediately go into an armed forces airstriking its own capital city for 3 months now, at least, pillaging, sexual violence, and systematic and ethnically motivated killings elsewhere in the country. So it's pretty devastating. And it's complex as much as it is fatal at the moment. Not only is there the front lines in Khartoum, and what we talked about in terms of the violence directly targeting civilians in and around Darfur, but also other parties to the conflict have come in. Also, the SPLM North has made advances in the Kordofan area, and some of the other rebel groups that signed a peace agreement have entered the fray now as well. Perhaps not by choice, but it's complex, and it seems that all actors are settling in for a longer conflict. I think there was a noble attempt at mediating this made, and it's clearly been given multiple chances to promote the protection of civilians, to provide humanitarian access, and we just haven't seen much of either on the ground. Many aid agencies have sort of downsized. We and others are still present across multiple offices, not unfortunately in Darfur or Khartoum. We're primarily helping scale up assistance to people who have left Khartoum, and working desperately to try and re-enter places like West Darfur, and when the time is right, into Khartoum itself. And at the moment, we have to commend the initiative and resilience of local committees, youth volunteers, the so-called emergency rooms, and other aspects that have stepped in this gaping absence, this hemorrhaging wounds across the country. We're trying to scale up. We're still operationally, it was tough. Banks not working, fuel supplies not there, Khartoum, all the warehouses and servers and suppliers that were based there all offline now. The connectivity was weak. We've now got workarounds to most of these, but we're still faced with bureaucratic restrictions. Still no visas been issued newly since the conflict began. Still a tough time with imports and transportation of certain supplies. So I absolutely agree with the comments before. We need to figure out ways to realistically provide physical protection now in Darfur. We need to rethink a little bit the engagement to reduce the humanitarian needs it causes through whatever direct and indirect means that are there. But we've also got to make sure that relief is properly scaled up to a really, was a hugely vulnerable country before, socioeconomically, but now it's really on its knees at the moment. So we need to make sure that relief assistance is there. And as I say, the Jeddah talks were a noble start. We had to at least go through that process, but now I think it's clear where the current parties are, and that we need to bring on not only the leadership of the US and the UN Security Council, but regional and continental powers as well, to make sure that there's humanitarian access, so we can scale up assistance and begin to lay foundations for some of these other issues that help restore some order or peace eventually, and then a transition in the future. Thank you, Jane.
Well, thank you, Will. Let me then just open up the conversation to a certain degree. We got one excellent question from the audience, which I would like to pose to all of you to some degree, and let me put it in context. The question is, what lessons can we learn from the Darfur conflict? And to put a little bit of context, having worked myself on the Darfur conflict and been part of the response, during the Darfur crisis, the international community tried many of the things that we were already calling for. They imposed sanctions. They asked the International Criminal Court to become involved in justice issues. Obviously, there was a massive military intervention by a UN-AU mission. There was a massive humanitarian response. What lessons have we learned, or have we not learned and need to learn quickly to respond more appropriately to the unfolding disaster in Darfur? And I'll start with Ambassador Sati, if I may, but I would ask all the other participants to add if they have any insights. Thank you.
Thank you, EJ. The first lesson for me is I would say the mistake that al-Bashir's regime committed at the outset of the conflict, not only in Darfur actually, but also in concerning South Sudan, which is seeking what I would call seeking military solutions to socio-economic and political problems. And this is really at the source of all the ailments and all the problems of Sudan, I think, since independence. The way we have handled the earlier 1955, I would say rebellion and later on relations with the SPLM, SPLA, and all the tragedies that happened in South Sudan and repeated in Darfur. The main lesson for me is that approach, the wanting to crush any dissidents and before and without understanding exactly what are the root causes of those issues. I think this is at the source of it. I have been there and I have been following that. There were many solutions which were offered to the Bashir's government at that time, but they did not want to take them. They insisted on going the military way. The second way is that the importance of understanding local dynamics in relation to the general national situation, and what I would call, and we all call, management of diversity. How diverse Darfur is, how diverse Sudan is, how can this be dealt with within a national framework that would respect and manage, diversity in a proper way. And in some ways, this is exactly what we are confronting with now. What we call Awlad al-Gharib versus Awlad al-Bahar, the sons of the West versus the sons of the Nile. And in one of its manifestations, this problem is what's about, because everything started in Darfur. Our inability to deal with the Darfur situation is causing exactly what is happening now in Khartoum. Thank you very much.
If I may, could we go in the same order we did before? So Eva next.
Definitely. Thank you, EJ. I'll stick to what I know here on the possibility of improving sanctions enforcement and application as compared to the last substantive round of Sudan sanctions from 1997 to 2017. I think we learned two major lessons from the prior round of comprehensive sanctions. The first is we know how the Sudanese military government attempts to evade these sanctions. We've seen them do it over the course of that prior period of sanctions from about 1997 to 2017. We saw the complexity of the ownership structures of Sudanese state-owned enterprises double and in some cases triple, hiding the actual actors, including entities that were engaging in trade or registering in foreign jurisdictions under multiple layers of ownership, such that the actors that were engaging in trade were not named the same as their owners who were the sanctioned entities. We have the ability to define US sanctions and multilateral sanctions quite broadly in order to include these subsidiaries, but we need to make sure that the network of these subsidiaries is well known and well publicized so that international actors, including businesses that might be trading with them, are aware of the risk involved. Furthermore, we need to be aware of the need for de-risking of finance associated with humanitarian aid and the ability to target these sanctions appropriately such that they do not appear to be a comprehensive punishment of the Sudanese people or the Sudanese economy, as well as having the mechanisms in place to peel back sanctions in the case of collaboration or a ceasefire in order to facilitate the returned delivery of aid and international support and enable any future civilian-led government.
Thank you for that, Eva. But just for the audience, and to some degree for my edification as well, what do you mean by de-risking, and what has the U.S. government done so far to kind of signal that the sanctions are very much targeted specifically at these conflict actors and not at other economic entities in the country? Thank you.
Definitely. So what we've seen from the recent sanctions is the targeting of two entities under each military actor. The entities under the RSF are entities that are publicly known to have traded and acquired weapons on the behalf of the RSF. The entities under the SAF are the two main owners of a wide network of SAF-affiliated companies that engage in all sorts of business from military production to agricultural development and export. What we've seen in collaboration with, or in concurrence with the issuance of these sanctions is the issuance of, I believe, 2 general licenses excluding humanitarian aid delivery from the enforcement of these sanctions. However, it's not clear to me from my perspective the effectiveness of those general licenses. I'd be interested to hear, particularly from Will, as to where the sanctions system can ensure that there are provisions in place, particularly for financial transfers on the behalf of humanitarian aid. And I would also be interested to see in the multilateralization and expansion of these sanctions, whether those entities that are acting in the agricultural sector are targeted to the same degree of specificity and effectiveness as those acting in the military production or procurement sector, and how the sanctions regimes more broadly can ensure that agricultural imports, other humanitarian requirements are in some way protected.
Thank you for that, Eva. If I can now turn to Kate. Kate, obviously the same question to you. What lessons have we learned from Darfur? But if you could also expand a little bit on the challenges that Amnesty and other human rights organizations are facing with the increasing complexity of UN politics, particularly in the Security Council, but more broadly, and what that means for your efforts to try to both have activists speak on these issues and to put pressure on the parties to adhere to human rights rules and laws. Thank you.
Thanks, EJ. So in terms of what we learned, I think this is unfortunately teaching us all that we didn't learn. First of all, once again, we're seeing high numbers of civilian deaths, human rights violations, and the international community is slow to respond. You referenced that advocates are calling for what we're being called for Darfur back in 2004, whatnot. But it took a long time and a lot of unnecessary death for the international community to reach that point. And now, even when you open the newspapers, unless you're following people who are specifically reporting on Sudan, you're really not seeing that breakthrough. I think most Americans are unaware that the crisis is getting worse because of the way it's dropped from the news. It's really difficult to get any kind of senior level attention as a result. Very much everyone's focused on Russia, Ukraine, unfortunately, at the expense of Sudan. And so I think what we're unfortunately going to see is the situation get worse before there's the political will to take the meaningful steps that will make the difference. The other thing is making politically expedient decisions at the expense of justice and accountability. Many of those who are committing violations now were the same actors who were in place in the early 2000s. And yes, the ICC did eventually issue some warrants, but many of the actors instead were still put into positions of power, and so are committing the same atrocities again. As you noted, the dynamics are really difficult, both at the UN Security Council as well as the Human Rights Council. As you and I know from our respective former roles, even trying to maintain a mandate for Unitans was very difficult in the face of opposition. This is where I think the US really needs to be stepping up its engagement with the AU and the A3. Right now, it's my understanding that the A3 members are still taking instructions from the Sudanese Perm Rep on how to vote in the Security Council, and the US should really be using its partnership and leverage with African countries to work towards a solution instead of excluding them at Jeddah the way they have. And I think until there's really senior level engagement with multiple different actors, that you're going to see these same struggles at the Security Council and at the Human Rights Council.
Thank you, Kate. And just to remind the audience, and perhaps to state the obvious, but when we talk about the Sudanese government, we are basically talking about General Burhan and the SAF being, the ones who occupy the official seats that Hamdok used to sit in, and obviously that does present a problem for many civilian actors who would like to have their voices heard, who would like to be involved in these conversations, but are having a very difficult time having their perspectives heard by voices, not just in Africa, but on the international plane as well. But let me turn over to Will. Will, Eva did ask you a specific question. If you could speak a little bit to the questions of licensing and how sanctions can, in fact, complicate your work. But if I can even complicate it more for you, you've also alluded to the fact that it has been very, very difficult for NRC to scale up its operations, in that in many of the most conflict-affected areas, it is these local groups, oftentimes called emergency rooms or resistance committees. They're known by a number of different monikers that are providing that kind of life-saving assistance. And if you could speak a little bit to how NRC is trying to work with them, and perhaps what more the international community can do, and perhaps as a former USG official, speak to some of the challenges that you have working with people like me in terms of our own bureaucratic processes and how as how the bureaucracy can oftentimes be maddeningly inflexible when it comes to dealing with these very fluid and complicated situations that you've already described to us. Over to you, Will.
Thanks, EJ. Did we learn something from Darfur? To our understanding, what's happening in Darfur is a continuation. There was never justice. There was never solutions for millions of displaced people. Since the withdrawal of the peacekeeping mission, we've seen multiple atrocities. To be honest, far before the 15th of April situation has started, and still this preoccupation completely or singularly with the democratic transition, which is incredibly important in the long arc of the country, but we also need to press for a comprehensive solution that helps protect people where they are. And so did we learn? The main thing that I think we should reflect on is it was slow to begin last time round, a generation before. As Kate mentioned, do we really need to wait a year for this to become absolutely crystal clear and for tens of thousands of more deaths and immense suffering? I don't think we should be patient like the people of Sudan. don't need us to be patient for this to be clear. And the US, which I think, was very well-informed global power, should be coming forward. And I see at least a difference this time in that even Kenyan President Ruto quite quickly has termed this a genocide. I wouldn't have seen African leaders before so quickly come to that conclusion. So I think it's important that we capitalize on a clarity now and to make sure that this is adjusted. UNITAM's mandate is supposed to help with civil protection. Clearly this is not the moment for civil protection, and if we think the sovereign state is willing or able of protecting people as it airstrikes its own capital and stays in its barracks in Darfur, I think we've got our answers there. So let's act for the people of Sudan and Darfur accordingly to stop this. So I think there's clearly there should be an impatience and a boldness to the actions that the UN coordinates with the different regional and continental powers, including those key allies, formally or informally, of the main conflict, main parties to the conflict. But yeah, impatience, I think, is key, to be honest. In terms of sanctions, the long shadow of issues, even after some of the initial sanctions were lifted, had banks de-risked, had other companies, technology, software de-risked. No, they had not. We couldn't use basic softwares here. But most importantly, and what's going to cripple us now, is getting international banking transfers, not because of legislation, but because of the extreme risks that now international financial institutes see for moving money to the country. We just have no commercial options. There's a complete monetary and macroeconomic failure right now. So not just for the humanitarian response, but for every citizen to withdraw money and to keep a market system surviving. I think there's something to invest and help correct. So there are technical issues with licensing, which are there, but I also think that there's US technical and commercial leadership to help resolve some of these issues for the wider good of Sudan. Of course, avoiding some of the war economy that is very likely to profit from some of this in the coming weeks ahead as well. And then, you asked about the locally led efforts, particularly emergency rooms, and many of them are tied to resistance committees. And absolutely, there's been a stunning resilience that needs to be supported and scaled. The majority of the main global institutional donors, although they want to do more for supporting local actors, were too stringent in terms of the funds and how flexibly they can be applied. It's pretty heavy processes, especially in countries where there's been sanctions and designated groups here, and there is a huge legal risk for agencies like mine when we operate. So I think that even if it's not quite the moments in USAID's transformation, encouragement and support for mechanisms that can allow flexible funding, I think that would be immediately helpful. And then let's accelerate. This is a clear case in point where international humanitarian assistance is at risk of being obstructed and diverted. It's all channeled through Port Sudan, which is 2,000 kilometers away from West Darfur, where we need to get assistance. It's like trying to coordinate, a response in, let's say, Moscow from Berlin. Is that really what we're doing these days? So I think that there's got to be a rethink of this. There's clearly a need for international humanitarian assistance to help, to supplement, to fill in gaps. I think there should be a good ecosystem between local actors that definitely, have a rightful place in the response and need further funding. It's just there's not many mechanisms or funds to do so. And for international humanitarian actors to be, more principled and more adaptive to this. And I just finish by coming back to your clarification, EJ, on we talk about the sovereign state as being responsible to protect people, as as requiring, we have to deal with the sovereign state for humanitarian access, but there was a military coup d'etat, 2 years ago. Who is the sovereign state at the moment? What is it? What legal framework are we leaning into? And what does the UN as a intergovernmental organization think is its ethical role at the moment. Maybe we need to reinterpret what the legal mandate for this is, and I think that requires strong US leadership and Security Council discussion to get to resolutions much quicker than they did the first time around. Thanks.
Some very profound questions, Will. Thank you for that. If I can now pose another question, perhaps for Ambassador Sati to start with, and perhaps if others want to join. But Ambassador Sati, when you first spoke about international efforts, there was a marked lack of reference to Middle Eastern states, and to some degree also some of the neighboring countries of Sudan that are quite powerful and obviously very much affected already by the conflict in Sudan. I specifically am thinking about Egypt and Chad, where there have been massive refugee flows, where clearly both Cairo and N'Djamena are very concerned about the spillover of insecurity. How long are these countries going to sit on the sidelines? And what else can these Middle Eastern partners of Sudan do to help come to some kind of a resolution, or are they not helping in your view? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, EJ. The most important thing is that Middle Eastern countries and friends of Sudan should refrain from doing whatever can cause the escalation of the conflict. For me, this is the most important thing. We know that some of them are taking sides, either the SAF on one side and RSF on the other, thinking that this could help them, serve their interests in Sudan. And I do not think that this is the right way of serving their interests. I have been saying this actually even before the coup. The problem now is, how are we going to convince those Middle Eastern powers that it is not in the interest, the ongoing war is not in interest, and that if they continue in the behavior that they are, following now, this will completely alienate them from the Sudanese people in general. And I think this should be my message, and this is a message I have been giving all the time, actually. We need to engage them. However, we need to engage them, and I admit that the civilians have neglected those powers, and this has caused, some kind of concern on the side of those powers. It's high time now we organize a principled dialogue with those powers and with all our neighbors and with the region in order to see how we can do things better, and how can we see to it that we work with them in order to serve their interests, provided that they respect the interests of the Sudanese people. Concerning Egypt and Chad, I think this is an issue. We need to look into that and see how we recognize the effort that they are undertaking. I know that South Sudan also and Ethiopia to some extent are doing the same thing. So we are thankful to them for what they are doing, but we would like them, of course, to do more, and we would like the international region community to assist them in doing what they are doing, so that to shoulder this responsibility, this renewed responsibility, and to avoid, of course, the spillover. Those countries have an interest also in stopping the war and working with us in order to see how this war can be stopped and how to avoid the spillover of the war to those countries. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Sati. Again, a reminder that there are many different actors who have an interest in what's happening in Sudan and would like to influence events there, and the need for much greater coherence and coordination in that response. And hopefully someone will step up and help provide that kind of a forum, and hopefully just one forum. As we know, there are a number of different efforts out there that are to some degree complicating efforts. If I could turn over to Kate, but perhaps and also return to Nuruddin Sati for the last 5 minutes that we have, unfortunately, for this discussion. This is a very rich talk, and we could go on for quite some time, but we are limited by the hour. But Kate, if you could kind of speak to this issue of how can we elevate the voices of the resistance committees, of local activists, those people who are not being represented currently by either the SAF and their and them being the government or the RSF, and aren't represented as of now in Jeddah, but are actively trying to work towards a solution. If you could speak to that, and then I also know that Ambassador Sati has been involved with some of these efforts. If you could speak to that as well, and what else you think can be done in Washington to do so, I would be very grateful. Over to you, Kate.
Yeah, thanks, EJ. And I really, with Ambassador Sati working so closely with the RCs on the ground, defer to his wisdom here. But I think the U.S. is starting to understand that they need to be more directly engaging with these groups and elevating their voices, listening to them. You've seen a lot with the statements that have come out have been very focused on the conversations with the parties in Jeddah. I think the U.S. could be putting out statements that put the RCs on equal footing, that make that clear that they're listening to them and engaging them. There's a wonderful engaged Sudanese diaspora here in the U.S. and I think State Department's already had one meeting, but I think they really need to be drawing from their expertise in their own communications with activists on the ground more. The UN could be doing the same thing. I know there was a closed briefing on Friday, but you can have open meetings that are including these Sudanese voices to offer a different perspective. And I think the international community, who has really lost, I think, the trust of a lot of the Sudanese by continuing to only engage with the two warring sides, needs to really be putting them front and center and listening to their ideas, even when they're not all in agreement themselves. That's just part of political discourse in order to regain some of that trust. But like I said, I defer to Ambassador Sati here.
Well, thank you very much. No, I don't have much to add, but actually, within the civilian side, we have been working very actively in order to put our acts together. Actually, we have shared a document that we would like to be a platform for action, for future common action within the civilian, groups, and we intend to convene a meeting for all those groups, of course, including the RCs, civil society, women groups, youth groups, and all the groups that have been constituted in Sudan and around the world in order to work for stopping the war, providing badly needed humanitarian assistance, civilian engagement in the talks, in the peace talks, civilian engagement in the peace process, civilian engagement in any future plans for rehabilitation and reconstruction. I think we all agree now on those 5 principles, and we are working very closely with the resistance committees and all civilian groups concerned within the country and outside the country. We engage in dialogue with the US also, with the EU, with the African Union, the UN and IGAD, and we are doing all we can in order to make our voices heard. And I think that this is beginning now, and the civilians are now being, we'll have this ongoing discussions with all parties in order to see how can we shape and frame civilian participation in the talks and in any attempts at a solution for the future. And I'm glad to see that the US, the State Department is engaged. A first meeting was organized a few days ago, and I know there is another meeting which is being planned with the RCs, the women groups and youth, and I think this is very important. We can see how this turns out, and how we will all work together in order to see that the civilians not only participate, but they will be in the lead for all these attempts. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Sati. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Will. And thank you also, Ambassador Yates, for your comments. Obviously, the Sudan crisis is an ongoing one. Past its prologue in Sudan, as we've mentioned a number of times, there are lots of lessons to be learned from past crises in the country. The one lesson I want to impart on everyone is that this conflict that is going on now can last for a very, very long time. Sudan is a country of 46 million people. This crisis is a humanitarian catastrophe, not just for the country, it's for the region. And as been mentioned already, refugee flows will not just go to neighboring states, they will also end up in Europe and the Middle East. And so this is going to be an issue that is going to be on the international radar for quite some time, and a coherent response is the best way to go forward. And as Ambassador Sati mentioned, it is the civilians that want peace right now. Neither the RSF nor the SAF feel that it is in their interest to negotiate a peace deal. They think they can still win this war, and we need to do whatever we can to help change that calculus of the generals. But we have run out of time. I thank all the participants for their insights. I thank the audience for their participation. Hopefully this has helped shape some of their thinking. If you have any ideas about other events that the Atlantic Council could host on Sudan or other issues, I think we would all welcome that. And again, we thank everyone for their participation, and we wish everyone a good afternoon and evening. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.